Let me just double check. Go for it.
We started, yeah. So thank you, Andy, for your time to do the interview with me, or whatever
Pleasure.
it's called. So you were asking me how I know you or how I know Richard. Well, I think I know. I met. I know a few of you from Antirom, and Antirom for me was always super amazing. I think it's one of those creative groups that definitely inspired a lot of people in the late 90s, early 2000s. I think Antirom, there was Itoy. I think Itoy,
Yeah,
Hans Bernhard, Hans is the first person I went, I literally went to Vienna. I called him, I have to meet you. So I took an airplane and met him in Vienna just to have a coffee with him.
That's very dedicated.
I was very impressed by Toy War and him, and then I got into the whole mess with all his other partners and attacking and stuff. That was funny. So there was Vuk Ćosić, the NetArt group, and there was this NIN group that I was part of. So there were all these little creative groups. Some were more business oriented, some were more art oriented. And I met, I think, Tom and Nick Rupp first, and then I met Rob LeQueen in Milan when he was working in Razorfish. And he was actually my roommate for a while. We lived together.
Okay.
In Milan. And then I met Andy. I applied for a job in Benetton, in Fabrica Benetton, because I needed a permit I needed a permit to stay in Italy. And I didn't like Benetton at the time. I was a bit annoyed by them. I didn't like these kind of companies. And then I had no choice. I had to apply. So let's see what happens. And then Andy was there. That's how I met him. And it turned out he knows Tom, and he was from Antirom.
Yeah.
And then I heard of you, I don't know how, I think somewhere. And I read an article, as I told you on Twitter, about Nazis and politeness, something. And it resonated with me for 20 years, and you told me you didn't write it. So it's
yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. I can't even remember what that article was now, actually. But yeah, no, it wasn't me.
But I associated in my memory, your name is associated with this article. How politeness is not necessarily that people are nice. It's a very kind of a light philosophical article. And this article used Nazi Party as kind of an example of people who are polite but not good, And because people accuse me of not being polite sometimes. I don't know, sometimes, and I always like that article as an excuse. Well, I'm not polite, but I'm a good person. So, and I remembered your name there. And then you popped up in Twitter a few weeks ago, and we hooked up. So,
the internet works, right? That's how it works.
Yeah. One thing I would like to ask you, I think it would be cool to ask, because I also asked Nick for Nick Rupp for interview, and I think it would be nice to put Tom, Nick, Rob and you, and then anybody else who is there, just to discuss Antirom, because I think Antirom is extremely important. I think a lot of younger kids, I teach design as well in Austria, and I think a lot of design kids have no idea about these things. And basically, if there was no Antirom, the way I understand history, there would be no swipe on iPad. That's what it's
well, who knows? I mean, I like to. It's nice to think that. I mean, I definitely think some of the kind of scrolling stuff. Was things that we discovered and kind of noodle around with. I kind of expect that people would come to those things themselves as well. I mean, Antirom's a funny thing. I hear things like this occasionally. I think, maybe it had more reach than I was aware of at the time. But it's also kind of one of those things that people say, oh, it's really important. But sort of nobody's heard of, and part of the reason is because we did very little online. And nowadays, if it doesn't exist on the internet, it didn't exist. So all that work we did on sort of kiosks and installations and CD-ROMs and things, it's quite hard to even see it now. I keep an old laptop, an old Mac PowerBook, just so I can kind of run it or show it occasionally. So it's good to hear. It's nice to hear that had an influence.
I actually just remembered I have an Antirom CD here in my office. I just forgot that.
Very good.
It's somewhere, but I'm gonna show it maybe later, or maybe when we meet with the other guys. So
the one with the Swiss cheese.
With the cow. Anyway, so Andy, you published the book Service Design. You were in Antirom.
Yeah.
So you do service design. How do you define service design?
Well, I kind of do service design. I mean, I more help and teach others to do service design these days. So the kind of story behind that was, I'll go back to the anti-ROM thing, actually. So one of the kind of things of anti-ROM is or was, that we were keen to explore this new thing called, new media at the time and interactivity. And this is one of the things that Andy Cameron, who I miss dearly, it's very sad that he died so young, was very, very good at doing. He did two things that I really admire him for. One was he often got sort of groups of young people together and kind of helped them and expose them to stuff and said, hey, have a look at this, play with this and stuff. And of course, we would kind of come back and kind of go, hey, look, I made this thing. And he would sort of go, you've already kind of gone beyond what I can do. But he was very sort of egoless in that respect. So he often stood in the background of those groups of people. And he did it sort of 2 or 3 times. I mean, with us and with Fabrica, and also then when he went to afterwards. And there's a lot of people in the interactive world who are influenced by him, or by people who were sort of taught directly by him as a result. And he never stood there to kind of be the big kind of guru of it all, and instead stood back. But the second thing he did, which was really good, was he often said, that's really interesting. Let me explain why that's important to you. And he had a very, very good understanding of media theory and history and semiotics. He could really kind of explain why this was sort of important, sort of culturally or as a piece of design affordance. And so what we were trying to do there was explore interactivity. Most of us had done filmmaking and things like that, and had come through. That was the degree we were on, was just photography, film, video, and digital media. And we were trying to understand the affordances of this new medium. So I've just triggered Siri somehow. Let me just kill Siri. And so, what does it mean to interact with stuff? What does it mean to have a piece of media, which is normally used to this idea that someone authors a piece of media and then people consume it? And then what does it mean to kind of suddenly that the authorship is really about the interaction? And the actual experience itself is not even the artifact. It's the kind of experience that the person's having whilst they're interacting with that thing. So it's quite kind of abstract. And how does it work? What gets people interacting and what doesn't? So a lot of the stuff we were doing was really trying to understand that, and a lot of the stuff we did was quite playful, because we discovered quite quickly that things that we quite quickly knocked up on a sort of Friday afternoon would have everyone crowding around it, sort of playing with it, and often things that we'd planned for ages and kind of worked out and then finally built weren't that interesting after all. So that'll give you that's like a kind of precursor to sort of agile in some respects. And, in that collective, there were sort of 9 or 10 of us, we all had sort of different skills, a lot of overlap too. And it was a very, very sharing environment where someone would build what we'd call an engine, which was the sort of code to something. Then someone else would go, I've got some really good assets, some video or some images or some sound to put in that. And sometimes the other way around. And so we would very iteratively work together. And then there was a guy called Ben Reason, who was a friend of Nick's, I think, and Tom's, and Nick had known from college years. And Ben came and worked with us too for a little time, and stayed friends with him. And then when I was teaching interactivity, also interactive media in Australia, our faculty was having a kind of restructure. And I remember that we were sort of sitting around, mostly designers and artists sitting around a boardroom table, sort of reading out sheets of A4 at each other. And I remember thinking, this is a design process, right? Or designing the organization is a design process. Why are we kind of going through it in this non-designery way? And I got more and more interested in the idea of kind of designing organizations, and kind of I'd always been interested in a sort of systems view of things too, and sustainability for that matter, and they sort of all come together. And then when I was in London in around 2000, 2001 or something, I went to visit Ben and then Lavrans and Chris Downs in their studio in London. And I was talking to Ben, and Ben said, "Oh, well, we're doing this thing called service design." And there'd only been, I think Live Work had been founded about a year before or something. And as he was sort of describing it and talking around what it is, which was this idea of instead of designing individual touch points like a screen or a product or a kind of website or an app or whatever, but actually thinking about how all those things hang together and making that a seamless experience regardless of the steps in the journey and transitioning from one to the next, or switching channels, like from going to a shop to having an online experience and things like that. Plus particularly back then, the whole kind of sharing economy was a big part of thinking around the shift from product thinking to services. And also therefore...
This is first half of 2000s, yeah?
Yes, it's early 2000s, like 2001 too.
Mm-hmm.
And then the idea that you have to, in order to deliver those things, you actually have to redesign the way the organizations function in order to deliver that thing. Because it's a shift from a kind of factory thinking to a much more of a sort of ecosystem thinking. And that for me was the sort of beginnings of it all. And then I started sort of moving across into that. And, you know, a lot of it comes from digital. There's some other areas that service design comes from too. But a lot of it comes from people like myself being asked to design a really great thing for the wrong reason and wanting to kind of move further up the chain of that process and those decisions. And so that was for me kind of that shift. And then I was starting to teach it, and I didn't have the textbook to teach from. And I kept saying to Ben and Lavrans and Chris, hey, when are you guys going to write a book? Because you literally sort of wrote the book on service design, and then we'll get around to it sometime. And then I decided I was going to start writing it. And my original plan was to speak to lots of different service design agencies, of which there were only like 3 or 4 at the time, and then write it that way. And then Ben and Lavrans said, "Oh, we'll do it with you." So that's how that came about.
Okay, so but who was your first client? Where did you implement service design? You know, because this sounds awesome to me that was done already 20 years ago. You were doing something 20 years ago, and it for me it's very logical that a digital person was doing that. I think digital people brought a lot of these ideas into what was, you know, traditional business. But I mean, early 2000s seems early. So I'm very keen, like, who was the first client?
So, I mean, of mine, I would think, I mean, it was actually doing some work for Live Work, probably when I was doing it professionally, aside from teaching. In teaching, there was some NGO stuff, and there was some kind of projects we were working on with a group of pharmacists and pharmacy students and a group of design students and design professors collaborating on an online thing, actually, to address some health issues in a tiny village in Kenya. And then I had so some of the work with Live Work, and I think one of the things that one of the sort of early clients of Live Work was a car sharing service called Streetcar. And again, you know, the idea of switching from rolling out a product to thinking about what's this as a service and where can it kind of fail in many kind of parts. So that I know was one of their first clients, and I did some work with them on some other clients, which I don't know if I can name or not, so I shall kind of leave off. But there were just sort of a couple of sort of research things for me. Actually, it was more putting on my design research kind of hat and working that way.
Okay. And what is the biggest organization you implemented service design in, or you helped implement?
Probably in my time in Australia.
Just the
title. That's all right. Yeah, no, I will say. So probably in my time in Australia, there was a couple of government agencies, and 2 or 3 actually. So I did my first kind of time in Australia with Fjord. I was doing quite a lot of. So actually, here in Europe, in the UK, it was actually there was some stuff with banks. Financial institutions, and then in Australia, the government service stuff, and those things I would say are the biggest, in the sense of, it's not, you know, obviously you don't really measure government services by their sort of turnover or kind of headcount stuff, but in terms of impacting many people, in one case, like every Australian, that's where kind of some of those projects got implemented. And then there's a couple of others where it will affect people's, again, I really can't say the names, but it will affect people's well-being and their ability to kind of have a happy life, basically, in the things that they're doing through that. And those are really, really long-term projects. And when you said implemented service design, you can't really kind of even talk about it that way, because there was a sort of service design project that's sort of impetus to something, but as it starts to kind of roll out, it becomes the entire sort of organization, or at least a kind of large part of it.
So service design is what maybe some would refer to as customer journey, customer experience. What is the difference, if not?
No. No. It's part of it, right? So there's a cultural thing here and a geographical thing. So I know in the US, sort of UX is often seen as the umbrella term of which service design is a kind of subset. Most of the rest of the world, it's the other way around, and I'd still argue it's the other way around. I often talk about these kind of Zoom levels of kind of thinking, right? Most UX, although a lot of UXers say, yes, but we do more than kind of websites and apps. When I go to UX conferences, most people are showing websites and apps. And so it's mostly screen-based touch points. And whereas service design really concerns itself with this idea of front stage and backstage. So there's all the touch points that the customer or the end user, and it could be a citizen, it could be a patient, doesn't have to be sort of customer in the classic sense, see and experience. But then there's all the backstage stuff of how does that actually get delivered. So, and then with that comes how does it get delivered technically? So the kind of feasible part of it, and then what's the business model behind that? In some cases with new services, it's really much more of a kind of venture type thing. In other cases, it's more around the business design of it is really looking at the aggregate kind of cost savings or efficiencies and stuff that happen over time. Because you might save something like a technician 12 minutes per job or something, and that could add up, as one case I'm thinking of, that could add up to like 2 extra jobs a week. In Australia, in this particular example, there were 3,000 techs, so 6,000 extra jobs could be done a week, and that's saving that company $4 million a month. Right? But at 12 minutes, when you look at it like that, it looks like a tiny thing. So the relationship between those two is really crucial in service design. And that's where I think that often UX, if you put UX with kind of enterprise UX and employee experience kind of all together, plus some kind of business strategy stuff, that's kind of the scope, I would say, of service design.
Well, I use the term customer experience in particular because I personally don't like user experience because I work because of users. Because user means someone free, meaning you go to Facebook and use it for free. I don't like that. It seems a bit dishonest. The customer, you're buying something with your attention. I don't that I prefer. But when I say customer experience, I mean every interaction or a touch point. They're the same term that a customer has with a company. So how can that be improved? So I understood service design is that thing. You're looking at every interaction, offline, online, and then adjusting the processes inside the companies and improving efficiencies towards the goal of improving the customer experience. Okay, cool.
Yeah, and the difference is, I suppose, is that one journey is or kind of even like a kind of hero journey, which is a sort of made up fictional kind of journey that most people might have through a service. Is one customer journey is kind of one through line of a service ecosystem, right? So if you think, you're trying sort of designing that ecosystem, and of course people take whatever journey they want through it.
Yeah. Well, I like what you're saying is that you improved you improved well-being of millions of customers, and
hopefully, or made it kind of terrible. That's what we're trying to avoid.
I believe you. I think that it's important for us who design that we believe in this because many people downplay that, but design has that role. That's the role. So what I wanted to ask you is that because I want to talk about innovation and that innovation is basically change in society, and what my biggest interest that I wanted to ask you is what role companies play, what is the role of companies in innovation, in change in society, and then what is the role of big companies? Are they slow? Are they keeping it back, or are they accelerating the change in society? So
there's 2 or 3 questions in there, and which one do you want to go for first?
Well, what is the role of a company in change in society change? That's the first one.
Right. So the first thing is what's the role of a company, right? The one answer is to make money. But that's not usually the purpose of a company, although it's sort of become that, and in sort of late stage capitalism, it's become that. That's not really the purpose of a company. Particularly if you look at a company that's been around for a while, you sort of go back to the kind of founding, normally fathers, founding kind of people mission statement of that company and purpose of it. It's not that usually. It's just become that now because we've got this kind of financialized capitalism where it's all about kind of returning shareholder value and nothing else, which is kind of shifting, I hope. So the purpose of a company is is to serve a customer need, right? Without that, it doesn't exist. And so it could be anything. It's ultimately to sell something to people, and hopefully it's stuff that people want. Now, there's different flavors of that. I think the next part of the purpose of a company for society is there's a real difference between what it actually is and what I would like it to be. What it actually is at the moment is mostly around returning shareholder value, and it's mostly around growth, and it's predicated on a kind of idea of infinite growth, right? Which, as we all know, on a finite planet isn't possible. So, it's a system that's destined to break at the moment, and kind of what you're seeing going on at the moment is a kind of one half of the world kind of going, we need to put the brakes on this and think differently about it. And the other half of the world going, just kind of floor it until we kind of get to that point, and we'll make as much as we can up until then. I even amongst, there are some sort of diehard, climate change skeptics, but I suspect that even amongst them, there's a kind of larger group of people who are, it's more about sort of self-deception that things aren't that bad. And, as long as I get through my lifetime, I don't really care. So, so the purpose of a company in society, there's a really good book by Umir Hack, I hope I pronounce his name correctly, called Betterness. And he talks about this idea of the commonwealth, as in, not the Commonwealth as in the UK, but the commonwealth, which is to return wealth back into the kind of common good, if you like. Instead of just passing it around kind of buckets of certain kind of elite investors, which is kind of what it mostly is at the moment.
Yeah, but I see, like, what is one thing that
I've just lost your sound.
Hello?
Yep, I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay, so I have to stand like this to be clear.
That's okay. I don't know what happened
then. Yeah. So what is one thing if we take away from a company, stop being a company? What do you think? Maybe that's a good way to think about it.
If you take away,
I see money as a result. I see money as a result and as an internal motivation.
Yeah, it's an enabler, and it's a result. Well, I say it's a result. It really shouldn't be a result. And actually, one of the kind of the sort of earlier forms of organisations were, of returning some of that capital back into reinvesting into a company in order to, make things better, to expand, of course, but also to, make workers' lives better equipment, and pay people better, and all that kind of stuff. Right? And so. The idea that you would kind of actually do the opposite and try and run that thing to the bone in order to kind of cream off as much kind of profit to the people who kind of put the money in is more recent than people kind of like to think. So I think that if you take away...
Meaning, if you take away companies, what's missing? What's missing?
If you take away companies, what's missing?
As well, I'm just giving different thoughts.
I think if you take away customers, or if you take away people who want the thing that organization provides, and if I'll include sort of government services there as well, right? So want or need that thing that organization provides, then you don't really have anything at all. There's not really much purpose in that thing existing. The reason why anyone sets up any organization, whether a government one or a company, is because they feel like they have an idea that will meet a need out there that's not being met, or at least in their particular area or niche, it's not being met, and that will provide them both the kind of sense of purpose in life and financial means to sort of make a living. That's ultimately there. If you take away the kind of if you make something that nobody needs, well, the world is littered with them, right? So you don't have a company anymore. If you take away companies from society, you remove a kind of formal structure for people to do that together with. So in its optimum sort of scenario, a company is a handy way to group people together and work together collectively instead of everyone kind of toiling away on their own. But the kind of extra bit of that is that a company came to become a legal entity as like a kind of virtual person on its own with rights, in some cases voting rights, in some cases property rights that are sort of can override individual rights, and that's really problematic, particularly how it's sort of come now to be now. David Graeber talks about this a lot in a lot of his kind of writing.
Okay, I'll check it out. David Graeber.
Graeber. Yeah, he wrote. He wrote a book about the history of or sort of debt, a history of debt, and sort of the first 5,000 years. He also wrote a very good book called Bullshit Jobs. And so sort of may come back to what we were talking about. There's an awful lot of kind of busy work and the rise of kind of jobs that are just kind of nonsense jobs inside organizations for the sake of kind of getting bigger.
Anthropologist and anarchist.
That's right. Yeah.
Anarchist. Yeah. I'm an anarchist as well. So that's.
You're like him.
Yeah, that's a good way. I'll check it out. But so if we are saying that companies are there to satisfy a need, meaning they have to do something good. And you were talking about negative examples,
they don't have to be doing something good, but they do have to be satisfying a need. They should be doing something good, but
well, good from certain perspective, So for the customers,
well, but there's companies that make kind of tear gas, right? So
well, the customers of the police are very happy.
Yeah.
And those who need police. The point is that, so is that purpose lost? So what I'm trying to get at is that there is a theoretical expectation of a company. Like we all think, there is a need for a company that's, societal need. Just like there is a religion, there are companies, there are non-profits, there are governments. Companies is a part of society, does something, and it wouldn't be there if it doesn't do something. But is that lost as a company starts to grow, and what is the best forms? You have startups, small companies, micro restaurants, you have medium, you have these enterprises that are huge. You work mostly with big companies, or which size do you work with?
Most of my work right now is design leadership coaching, actually. So I'm working with leaders of design teams, departments, regions. And sometimes I work with the leaders of designers, if you like. So those are non-designer leaders, so executives who are kind of in charge of something but don't necessarily have a design background. And so they come from a lot of them. Some of them are in small agencies, some of them are in big enterprises. And certainly in my time at Fjord, it was mostly large enterprises.
Yeah. And do you think that maybe that the big companies, do they lose the purpose? So is, in general, or maybe just,
Yeah, there's two things that happen. One is, the bigger you get, the harder it is to even manage kind of focus, right? And so you've got this massive kind of system of systems, and it's very, very complex. What's going on, the interactions that's going on, and you have usually different kind of goals and KPIs and stuff that are in tension or opposition to each other. So a company might want innovation, for example, but at the same time they don't want people doing anything that's going to kind of jeopardize. They also want to avoid risk, and so those two things kind of are in opposition to each other. So there's that. The second thing is, and I've talked about it a bit before, in terms of kind of growth at all costs, or growth is the number one metric. And so if you're just focused on growth, it's really, really easy, and it's what's happened with most large enterprises, is to forget why. It takes a bold CEO or board to say, we're big enough. Because the idea is, if you're not growing, you're dead, right? You're dying. The idea of kind of staying at a good size is a kind of anathema, because it doesn't sort of seem to return the sort of exponential, growth or the large growth that shareholders want.
Yeah, this is the poster by a Dutch artist. Stagnation means decline. Yeah,
right.
I like that one.
So but when you grow, and that's the kind of only metric, you start, what it's about really is about prioritization of kind of resources and effort, right? So you have, like any of us, you have a certain amount of hours in the day, a certain amount of time you're going to spend working, and a certain amount of money and or other resources, right? And so you have to decide what you're going to do with them. You can't do everything. And one of the ways you decide by that is your value system. And you say, well, that thing's important to me and that's not. And classically, as soon as people become parents, their value systems change radically. And one of the things is you're not number one anymore, right? Your kids are. And so there are people who would, happily work ridiculous hours all the time and kind of, really be kind of diehard kind of workaholics. But, and sometimes they do neglect their kids. But quite often what happens also is a thing that used to be, I can stay an hour later, suddenly becomes a solid, I have to go now because I have to pick up my kid from school. I'm not going to leave my child waiting at the school gates. Right? So that just becomes a kind of absolute firm. So that value is above this other one. Which was previously might have been the primary value. And so values are really important, right? To purpose. You have to have a think about what are we here to do? And then what are the, what's our value system with which we're going to execute that stuff. And that value system is really about what do we place as more important than other things when we're making choices about where we're going to spend time, what we're going to spend time on. And there are these things called even over statements, which are really useful. So you have two competing things. So it could be something like customer experience and profit, right? There are two things that are desirable, and you have to choose. You go, well, we're going to go for customer experience even over profit, or we're going to go for sustainability even over growth. Right. So what that does is starts to highlight, okay, when it comes to having to make a choice, it's easy to make a choice between, bankruptcy and, being a millionaire. It's much harder to make a choice between two competing things that are both enticing. Right? And so your values are what help you decide between those two things. It's like, it's the difference between, making money through a hard day's work and stealing it. Right? In both cases, the end result's the same, but your value system decides what you do. And so when growth becomes the primary value, it's very, very easy to say growth over everything else. And that's over ethics, that's over sustainability, it's over
also short-term growth,
and so,
I think.
Yeah. Or so sustainability is the good one, because it's like, well, short-term growth, regardless of the kind of long-term consequences. And so purpose and values become incredibly important for organizations right now. And what they're really struggling with is, because they've had this model where growth has been this infinite thing, or perceived to be this infinite thing, now they're starting to have to realize that that's not an infinite thing. So they actually have to they've been laboring under an illusion for sort of half a century or more. And now they're kind of having to rejig, and the kind of muscle memory and the kind of way of thinking about that stuff just isn't there at all. It's really kind of confounding a lot of the sort of classic management thinking.
Yeah, I like that you're using the term muscle memory. I think that's a very good metaphor. Saying that they have learned something that it's very hard for them to unlearn. But it seems to me that you figured out that you're passionate about changing this, about educating them to do something else. And I'm guessing because you believe that if they change, that's going to be good for everybody.
Well, yeah, I mean, in some respects, they have to, right? So there are certain industries, like fossil fuels is the obvious one, but there's certain industries where there's just no way you can carry on the way they're kind of growing, and you're really seeing that they're massively not growing at the moment as a result of kind of what you saw in COVID, right? That's been a huge decline. There are certain things that just are not possible in the future. So unless you're kind of switching to an alternative model, then those companies will just cease to be. Because going back to the first thing, they'll be producing a thing that nobody wants anymore.
Yeah. Well, they can still choose to do another, not such a good thing.
They can, and some of them are, and some of them are, It's.
But
I mean,
some of them are working with you, trying to make it better. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's very, very hard for also. We think of companies as if they are, especially sort of big established companies like insurance companies and banks and stuff. We kind of think of these things as if they are kind of clearly defined, sort of well-oiled machines And they're really not, almost all the people working at one of those companies, particularly something like a bank and insurance companies are quite good examples, and government too. There's no one working in that company. There's probably no one still alive who was around when many of the sort of the sort of value in the mission statement and purpose and many of the systems were laid down. So what actually most people are doing inside a large enterprise is it's much more like a kind of mystery box. It's like this black box, and a certain person from a department's got access to a couple of levers and buttons, and they know they've worked out over time that if I kind of pull them this way and press them that way, a thing happens which, is useful for their job or kind of benefits them. And we have this idea of the kind of CEOs as being sort of captains of industry, as if they are kind of, steering a ship with kind of certainty through, and charting a direction. And really, a lot of the time, it's much more like they're kind of balancing on a greasy pig, hoping not to fall off before their kind of tenure is up, and they and they get the bonus, which incidentally they quite often get whether their company's gone down or up, right?
Yeah. Okay. Well, my prejudice, and also from my experience, is that big companies are, I work with like CEOs of really big ones, before they were also investors in my projects and stuff. And I didn't have a good impression in terms of their understanding of creating new things for customers. I see them as politicians moving from one thing to another. And I have to say that I'm really enjoying that you're more into that, and you're offering much more detail to my extremely simplified prejudice, because it seems, my impression is that you're in there, you're working with big organizations, trying to motivate them to, to survive by innovating, using my terminology, and that's good for them and the customers, instead of being something that they learned before, and which is not good neither for them nor for the society, for the customers, whatever you call it.
I mean, I think one of the things to be some more empathetic about this is that, and the reason why I was saying it's much more like a mystery box, and it's a lot of the work in, it's almost like archaeology, there's these layers of systems and procedures and processes in a large organization that have been laid down by the people before. And it really is, HR is a classic one. You kind of ask people, how does HR work in an organization, in a large organization that's been around for 100 years? And quite often people know there's no one you can find who can give you the answer, because it's this kind of complex beast. And so the people and executives and the C-suite who are kind of running those things, two things are going on. One is that they are, what they're kind of dealing with is this really complicated or complex thing that no one really fully understands, right? And it's a kind of an ecosystem that's very complex, and you change one bit here and all sorts of unintended consequences happen. And the second thing is, and it's my biggest complaint, is that they're terribly time poor. The idea that let's say you're kind of pitching something to a CEO and someone says, okay, well, you've got kind of, I can give you 10 minutes, before lunch or at lunch, and you can only have 6 slides or something, to pitch something. It means they're making decisions, really important decisions, based on really poor information. And actually, I think the CEO should have the most leisurely pace in an organization and not the most hectic one, whereas actually the experience is they're constantly pinging from one thing to the next, often feeling like they're being very productive, but actually they need space. They need space and time, as we kind of all do, and that's all been enforced on us recently with coronavirus, to actually kind of think about and consider things. That should be their job, is to really think about and consider things before making decision, not kind of running at full tilt, kind of going crazy. And a lot of the coaching work I do with sort of leadership is time management and setting boundaries and things for that reason.
So you're saying that big organizations, big companies can change, but they have blocks. Something's blocking them. So what would you say? Time, resources, the style, the culture. What's the biggest block for them to produce more value? The goal is that they do more value, give more value, which is good for them and good for the customers. What's blocking them?
So, themselves, right? As the case on personal development, right? We all block ourselves. So, there's a lot of kind of innovation theatre that happens, and there's a lot of stuff where, you know, a sort of sealed off group of people will do some new things, but it's very, very hard for that to get back into the organization. And there are kind of ways of doing that where you do actually need to protect that group of people to start with, because those ideas are often fragile, they often go against the status quo, and they're very easily crushed. But eventually that sort of like a tick, you know, the kind of insect, it needs to sort of dock onto the main body host and then gradually kind of expand. The things that, you know, coming up with ideas and, you know, coming up with new ways of doing things, which is, you know, or birthing new ways of doing things, where kind of novate of innovation comes from, isn't that difficult, actually. And the kind of, I have a thing I say, which innovation is conversation plus doing, which is really, you can't just talk about it and you can't just do, you know, and just go kind of, okay, let's just make that thing. You actually have to have that. It's reflective practice, right? You start doing something, and once you make it manifest, and that's the idea. That's the great thing about design and designers, is that they can make abstract ideas tangible in artifacts. Yeah. And you see it and you go, oh, now I see that. That's not going to work, right? That's not what I thought it was going to be, or I've painted myself into a corner, or whatever those things. So that process is pretty established, pretty well known. Designers all know it. It comes up against sort of corporate culture in the most banal of ways. And I talk about the 4 or 5 horsemen of the corporate apocalypse, which is HR. So can't hire the right people, can't hire ahead of the curve, can't hire into roles because they don't exist, and there's a standard sort of set of roles and so forth, right? Mm-hmm. So if you want to try and hire a bunch of new people, but you've got a set of established roles in an organization, then it's very, very, you know, how do you hire those new people? And often there's regulations set up like that. Can't kind of pay them right and all of that sort of stuff. There is procurement. So on all ends of that, getting the right tools, getting the kind of right equipment, and so on and so forth. Pain, teeth pulling, sort of pain, plus kind of the whole RFP process and of kind of large enterprises, of how they interact with kind of external agencies, is completely broken. And then you have facilities, and I kid you not, I've had a client group not be able to kind of book a sort of war room, a project room, because they weren't allowed to book any spaces. And B, once we then did put a load of Post-it notes up and did a sort of synthesis for a whole day on something on a Friday, on the Monday they came in and the cleaners had cleaned all the Post-it notes off the wall because, you know, there's a clean wall policy or something. So stuff like that, where, you know, you can't work that way. You can't work in those new ways if the kind of organization is getting in the way. And then the other 2 are sort of IT and finance. And all of those things, all of those departments, I don't mean to malign any of the people in those departments, they all exist to maintain the status quo and avoid risk. And so, you know, there's all good reasons why you might have a clean wall policy, for example, you know, but if you want that kind of the company to be more innovative and to work in different ways, you have to actually work on all of that structural stuff. Otherwise, you just can't do it. It fails, and you get people they get trained up in it and they leave because they get the organization does it, and then they kind of it loses energy. It can't get through the organization, and you get what I call organizational amnesia, which is someone like me gets called by the same company 2 years later to do the same thing all over again. And you're like, what happened?
Yeah.
You know, and it just stymies, you know, the basic structural stuff just stymies the kind of ability to work in a new way and to innovate, and for the right people to have the right conversations at the right time. And it's not very sexy. It's completely boring, you know. Stop the cleaners cleaning stuff off the wall. Let people book a kind of a room that they need, you know.
That cleaner really pissed you off. Yeah.
No, but it's also let them use the tools that are kind of modern tools for doing this stuff, you know, and not have kind of IT determine. No one comes up to you and says you can't use this pen or that pencil, but it's the equivalent, you know, with sort of IT tools sometimes. All of that stuff.
HR, IT, and finance and facilities. So all the
procurement,
all the structures, all the silos or whatever that they have no contact with customers.
No, and 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 their job is to have the sort of best interest of the company,
Yeah, yeah.
ostensibly the best interest of the company, and that's the sort of paradox. Is that on the
Without
one
any
hand,
perspective of the customer, without any idea of the customer, because I
yeah,
never met them.
but also with a very inward facing, yeah. So
Yeah.
with a very inward facing, it's not so much about the customer; it's more around the kind of work that people might be doing,
Mm.
and it's more around kind of maintaining existing structures.
Mm-hmm.
And putting things in place, and once they're in place you don't really kind of touch them again, in that shearing layers model, Stuart Brand's thing of, it's one of the kind of lower level things that moves incredibly slowly, whilst the world out there is moving very fast. That's
Yeah.
why it's hard for large old companies to really pivot in terms
Mm-hmm.
of purpose and the way they work.
Is there any possibility that those departments, are maintained to be such to support some kind of another strategy, which is basically status quo, for example, Coca-Cola has the same product, I don't know, like 130, 40
Yeah.
years, how long. And I assume everything is there the same. I think whatever they created in finance and something like 120 years ago, that's how it is. I don't think they just copy paste it.
Yeah.
And but that serves them, that they appear as big and hard to change. That's part of their power. Because if they were
Yeah.
able, if they were easy to change, then they would change other things which make them money. In a way. So maybe that's a defense mode.
Yeah, it is, and it's like I said, it's all there for good reasons, right? And so don't break
Meaning,
something
if my experience is, if a CEO comes and says, or an owner, comes, okay, enough with this, that they could change in a day, And,
well, yes and no. I mean, the impetus has to come from the top. It doesn't change in a day, though. I mean, any of those things are a kind of year or two's worth of work. And there are different ways of. I mean, there's all these kind of different ways that come from sort of Silicon Valley of structuring companies and doing them different. It's a lot harder to do it in an existing one, but it's not impossible. There are lots of ways of changing an organization in terms of how people are paid, how much transparency there is around pay, and with that, then what are the kind of targets and motivations for people, and then with that, looking at how do you let people to be, you hire people and they go through this kind of rigorous interview process, and then you treat them like kids. And so, how do you sort of treat your staff as if they're responsible adults and give them more responsibility and let them do their stuff? And then what does that mean in terms of the kind of structures that you need for that to happen, and so on and so forth? And so, there is stuff out there, and there are companies who are doing it. It's like I say, it's the toughest thing is for a company that didn't start up that way with that intent to kind of turn it around. That said, there are some very large companies that are around now that have turned into these kind of big sort of multinationals that did originally start in a kind of very different way, and they've grown into what they've become.
Well, do you have an example of a big company changing? Best if you were part of that,
I don't, I get asked this quite often, actually, and obviously clients ask this quite often. And there are kind of very few. There's a book by Aaron Dignan from the Ready called Brave New Work, and there's another group of people called Corporate Rebels. And on their sites, the same kind of companies come up quite often. But most of those who are doing it quite well have already kind of had they sort of started with that intent. The companies that I know who are sort of they're all in the process of turning around. It's been interesting, for example, to see, say, a company like Microsoft switch from basically selling Windows as the operating system and so forth to being real champions for kind of accessibility and inclusivity and stuff. And a lot of that's kind of personal stuff for someone very high up who's got a child with disability. I think that's one of the things behind. In the Microsoft case, or a company that's switching to become more and more sustainable, there's a few of those around. There's a lot of change going on. A lot of companies have gone, a lot of the banks, who are primarily in the business of making money, right? I mean, banks, it's the medium of banks is money. A lot of banks several banks have done an awful lot to kind of really focus much more on the customer experience and make those things better. So, you know, it depends on what, you know, turning around is or kind of change. Depends to the degree of it, the degree of it that you're kind of really asking for.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I feel both happy and depressed.
Yeah, it's my sort of permanent state of affairs.
Yeah, it's like I'm euphoric. Yeah, something is going better, and because my vision is you know, innovation delivers value for customers, meaning everybody, and the more companies innovate, the better it is. But I'm very strict on innovation. I want to see that it really immediately makes something better for customers. I'm not a fan of, you know, like fake things, internal things, signaling, you know, pretending. And so I'm always looking for companies that are like, you know, one day I go to the shop, they have one product, I come back 3 months later, there is something like, wow, completely different, you know. And
but you know,
I see a lot,
sorry, go on. You see a lot,
and I see a lot of companies just selling the same thing over and over. I mean, I'm like, you know, when I met you first, I was 20, now I'm 40 something, 42. And it's kind of like some companies are still selling, it's kind of the same thing. I mean, they change the font, you know, and they're, you know, not
well,
much.
sometimes I don't mind. You know, sometimes if a company is making beautiful fountain pens or kind of watches or something, then
that's,
you know, the innovation, if there is any, is around
beer,
sort of craftsmanship or you know, it's
beer.
about the craft of it in sort of backstage. But in fact, you know, keeping a product's quality constant is incredibly difficult. You know, and that's a real kind of thing in itself. There are other companies, it depends on the sector, right? In technology, of course, we expect innovation to come every 5 minutes, probably unfairly so. And in other things, innovation is just a massive kind of pain in the arse to customers, as all of a sudden, you know, for example, you know, this is a classic service design thing, actually, where a lot of, say, airlines or restaurants, McDonald's do it, other places, you know, you have, and banks, right? You have all this self-service stuff, right? All the stuff I can do on my phone now. In terms of online banking, used to be I would go into a bank and the teller would do it for me, and that person would do it for me. And so ostensibly, oh, isn't this great now we've put all this in your hands? But of course, every time I check in myself when I'm going through the airport via an app, I'm basically working for the airline for free. In fact, not for free, I'm paying them to kind of work for them. And so, you know, there are some innovations. Travel is a really good one because now, instead of going to a travel agency and someone sorting it all out for you, you have, you know, 20 browser tabs open and you're kind of checking prices, or, you know, and it's actually kind of really tedious to do so, although you kind of can somehow feel empowered that I've got the kind of choice and everything. So, you know, it's not all good. The thing that I would like to see more of, and you know, it's hard because you don't actually see it, is if you're going to innovate the customer experience, you cannot do it without innovating or in your employee experience, right? It's very, very difficult for to deliver something new without changing the way in which you deliver it. It's really obvious, right? It's with services, it's incredibly hard to deliver a great customer experience if the people who are involved in delivering that to customers hate their jobs, have really crappy tools with which to do it. You know, when you have a rubbish insurance company experience, it's not usually because the person you're on the phone to is deliberately being difficult. It's usually because the systems that they have to work with are blocking them. And so there's a lot of work to be done. And that was a kind of classic sequence of work, which is we get called in as an agency or as a consultant to improve the customer experience. And then once we've kind of done all of that and kind of got to the point where, okay, this is what the new experience is going to be, there's this kind of, despite us having said it before, there's this moment of realization of, oh, well, in order to do that, we have to completely change the way we operate as an organization and change the tools and platforms we use and the employee experience and training and stuff. And it's kind of like, yeah, you do. But somehow they kind of thought they were going to do something new by carrying on doing it in the same way.
Well, yeah, that's I'm trying to do that as well. There is no way around it. Yeah, but I don't know. I haven't found the essence. You know, that's what I'm looking for. Because in a lot of things that you say, because I grew up in a communist country with pretend companies which are actually government. So you know, you could be in the 80s in Yugoslavia saying some of those things. They're kind of the same things. Like, we don't have the tools, we don't get the reward. And also I was an athlete, and I spent a lot of time. At one point, I really wanted to see what makes top athletes perform. I was a triathlete, and so I went to Stellenbosch, and I trained with where the top guys are including some of the top British guys. And I saw, for example, Javier Gomez, who was like a multiple world champion, swimming in the same pool, waiting for a lady to finish her training, to enter, like zero resources. And his coach was, great guy, but they didn't have anything more than what I have. And he was kicking ass and I was not, I don't know. I think there is so much to figure out, but you really touched on a lot of things that I was saying. I'm very happy there is someone, going inside the companies, and I think that's great, trying to move them, faster than they fail, or at least so they don't maintain the thing that it is, because I think companies, our society is built, even in socialism, communism, whatever you call it, everywhere, company was always like the essential element of society. And if companies don't change, the society doesn't change, and companies have the power also to block the change. They can make a spaceship, or they can choose to always make the same thing. They can't do that. It's not going to happen by itself. Someone has to make a decision to make a spaceship,
Yeah, there's a lot more kind of fear and anxiety in companies and organizations than people probably think, and
yes, very stressful.
And again, with the focus on share price or shareholder value, and you've got these kind of twin masters if it's a public company, or even if it's a private equity company, you've got your customers, but the other customers, if you're in the C-suite, are your shareholders, and they often want opposite things, right?
Yeah, that's difficult. Hopefully that's going to change a little bit, with I see that it's moving. I refer to shareholder culture as management culture, because they're not working for the customer, they're working for their boss, and then the boss and the boss, and
yeah
at the end. Cool. Do you have any questions for me?
I'm interested in what you've heard so far. You've been doing a few of these, so what's been
this is just my third. I've done before. I think it's great. What I like is that you were answering my questions without me asking them. I have a bunch of questions on the screen, and you were going exactly even much better than I would ask, without me mumbling, trying to formulate the questions. Although I like to mumble a little bit, it makes it creates the authentic feeling. I should fall down or something, to make it. So I think it's really great. And as I said, my interviews are not, I'm not thinking about the audience. I don't care. I care that 10, 20 people that know me, that are making decisions, see that this maybe now a little bit, then in a month. And I know the people that follow me, that I think they're going to find this very, very interesting, And always, it's not exactly what you're saying. It's also what you're not saying, and that you are, that you're doing that what you're doing. So just like with Richard, when I spoke to him, he said a lot of things that are, maybe known, and I also like the things that he's not saying and that he's talking about it. And I disagree with a lot of things he says, but I think it's very important to have how to say, dialectic, conflict and stuff like that. So I think you're gonna like. I just agreed today with a very interesting consultant and a product designer from, I think he's in UK, Andrew Munro. I met him on Twitter, and he's a psychologist working on organizational psychology, and he's gonna also talk with a friend of his who specialized in psychology of innovation. So I'm going to send you the link. Yeah, so I booked an interview with them. Hopefully we do it on 3rd September. So I think you will like that. So I think they're going to go deeper into the psychology of what you said. Like you're at one layer, and they're the people that are doing working on 360 feedback and evaluations and stuff like that. So.
Right. Okay. Cool. Yeah, I mean, that's another whole area, but let's not go there.
They're hardcore, yeah.
All right. Well, look, good to chat. Good to talk to you.
Thank you very much.
I have to jump. Take care.
Ciao. Bye. Ciao.